Hello, this is G Park, and I will be presenting Module 1 product for the English for Online AP course today. Firstly, I'll start off with what the subject of my project was. That I will be talking about today is Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky. The two poems that I chose were For That He Looked Not Upon Her by George Gascon and Janet Waking by John Crow Ransom. The short story I chose was The Company Man by Ellen Goodman. Firstly, the question is, who is the outcast? Dictionary.com states an outcast as a person who is rejected or cast out as from home or society. Looking through all four of these stories, we can clearly see that this definition remains true for all four stories. In the novel Crime and Punishment, Rodion Raskolnikov, who is the main character, serves as the outcast within the story, as he is isolated or alienated from the rest of his own society, and even from his own friends and family. In The Company Man, the dead man, or the man who is the subject of the whole story, serves as the outcast within his own family, as he becomes increasingly disconnected from all of his different family members until his untimely death. In the poem Janet Waking, Janet is seen as the outcast, as her innocence protects her from the realization and the concept of death, which separates her from reality. She is rejected or cast out from reality. In the poem For That He Looked Not Upon Her, the narrator is the outcast. The narrator surrounds herself with doubt and a fear of trust, a fear of mistrust, which seems to be grounded in some past experiences with deceit or cheating. The first theme of discussion will be that obsession can develop into a deep isolation that alienates and separates oneself from even the deepest relationships. Throughout all four stories, we can see that this theme is interweaved into different characters. In Crime and Punishment, this theme is specifically weaved into the ideology of the main character, Rodion Raskolnikov, as he explores ideology similar to that of nihilism, or the rejection of all religious and moral principles, often in the belief that life is meaningless. In the quote from the book, he states, "Pain and suffering are always inevitable for a large intelligence and a deep heart. The real great men must, I think, have great sadness on earth." In this quote, he summarizes his own ideologies and the sacrifice that he acknowledges he must take in taking these ideologies on. Raskolnikov acknowledges the isolation and the alienation that he must face with these ideologies, and yet he still drives himself to separate himself further from his own relationships. In the poem For That He Looked Not Upon Her, the quote states, "The mouse which once hath broken out of trap is seldom ticed with the trustless bait, but lies aloof for fear of more mishap, and feedeth still in doubt of deep deceit." Through this analogy of the mouse being trapped in the trap, through the bait, it shows that the narrator is obsessed with this fear of mistrust and deceit, and it develops into a isolation from social responsibilities, social relationships with other people, and it drives the narrator to become more and more of an outcast. In The Company Man, the main character, or the company man, works senselessly and tirelessly to promote himself through his work, but through that he separates himself from his own family. His wife is quoted in saying she had, according to her daughter, given up trying to compete with his work years ago when the children were small. So this again shows a character, specifically in the short story, The Company Man, becoming so obsessed with work that it drives him to become isolated and becoming more and more of an outcast within his own social circles. And lastly, in the poem Janet Waking, the quote from the poem states, "Kneeling on the wet grass, crying her brown hen, translated far beyond the daughters of men, to rise and walk upon it, and weeping fast as she had breath, Janet implored us, wake from her sleep." Through this quote, we can see that Janet is obsessed with Chuck, or her brown hen, and is traumatized by its death. And this obsession with her hen, and this obsession with its death, eventually isolates her from the realization of death itself. Her innocence in this situation isolates her and separates her from her relationship with reality. The second theme of discussion is that pessimism is a fundamental factor of how people live and the world functions itself. In the short story, The Company Man, the company man's own wife sees the deterioration of their marriage and relationship. She states in the story, "A company friend said, 'I know how much you will miss him.' And she answered, 'I already have. Missing him all these years, she must have given up part of herself which had cared too much for the man.' Later on, his boss is shown to be replacing him, not even a few days after his funeral." The quote says, "The company president had begun discreetly, of course, with care and taste, to make inquiries about his replacement, one of 3 men. He asked around, 'Who's been working the hardest?' The pessimism the story shows toward human life and through the eventual deterioration of all things, and through life's rewardless journey that ultimately ends in vain, as there is no lasting legacy or reward that most people can live their life to enjoy. Near death's call shows that pessimism is fundamental to how the world functions, how people live. Crime and Punishment takes a more critical approach to pessimism, critiquing human nature itself. The main character, Raskolnikov, is quoted saying, "What if man is not really a scoundrel? Man in general, I mean, the whole race of mankind. Then all the rest is prejudice, simply artificial terrors, and there are no barriers, and it's all as it should be." And later on he also says, "Man has it all in his hands, and it slips through his fingers from sheer cowardice." Crime and Punishment showcases the pathetic and flawed nature of humanity through its cowardice and stupidity, which creates a self-made barrier for humans that keeps them from reaching even their own potential, although it is right in front of them. In Janet Walking, the quote is, "Janet implored us, wake from her sleep, and would not be instructed in how deep was the forgetful kingdom of death. In Janet Waking, pessimism is shown through the metaphorical forgetful kingdom of death. Janet must face the pessimism of the world through the concept of death, and must learn that it is essential part of people's lives and the world itself. In the poem For That He Looked Upon Her, the narrator shows again this pessimism, although through her mistrust, her fear of deceit, mistrust. In the quote, she states, "Whereby I learned that grievous is the game, which follows fancy, dazzled by desire. Said I wink, or else hold down my head, because your blazing eyes my bale have bred." So the short poem highlights pessimism in the case of, again, the narrator's fear of trust and mistrust and deceit, in that the narrator has fully drowned herself, indulged herself into the pessimism that is her fear of mistrust. The last theme of discussion is isolation is ultimately a destructive force within the psychology of human minds that drenches them in depravity. In the poem For That He Looked Not Upon Her, this theme is shown through, again, the mistrust that the narrator fears, her distinctive or instinctive fear of being cheated or deceived by others. In the quote, it states, "You must not wonder, though you think it strange, to see me hold my lowering head so low, and that mine eyes take no delight to range about the gleams which on your face do grow." This shows that isolation has destroyed the narrator's social skills and relationships, and has transformed the narrator into a fearful being or fearful person who cannot have regular relationships because of her fear of deceit. In Janet Waking, Janet must face the death of her prized Chucky, or her brown hen, and her isolation from reality, or from the realization of death, becomes a destructive force in her mind that worsens her state of depression when she must face the reality of death. The quote states, "And weeping fast as she had breath, Janet implored us, wake her from her sleep. It would not be instructed in how deep was the forgetful kingdom of death." This is the same quote as from the last theme, but this quote can also be shown to used to show how isolation, again, her isolation from reality, becomes a destructive force when faced with death, which is a fundamental part of reality, and this worsens her state of depression even further. In the short story The Company Man, isolation as a destructive force is seen almost literally as the company man's isolation from family and friends and relationships other than from work literally kills him. The quote states, "He was a perfect type A workaholic, a classic. They said to each other and shook their heads and thought for 5 or 10 minutes about the way they lived. This man worked himself to death finally and precisely at 3 o'clock a.m. So this is a literal interpretation of the theme that isolation can become destructive to a person. And in Crime and Punishment, this theme is shown through the quotes. Not that he understood it, but he sensed clearly, with all the power of sensation, that it was no longer possible for him to address these people in the police station, not only with heartfelt effusions, as he had just done, but in a way at all. And had they been his own brothers and sisters and not police lieutenants, there would still have been no point in addressing them in whatever circumstances of life. In Crime and Punishment, the isolation grows into guilt, into fear, into panic, paranoia that Raskolnikov experiences after he murders the two women in his social experiment on his theory of supermen, or the intellectual elite, as mentioned before. He becomes completely paranoid with all social interactions, and he loses his ability to maintain social interactions without extreme fear that interrupts his thoughts. This is again shown in the next quote. The old woman was a mistake, perhaps, but she was not the point. The old woman was merely a sickness. I was in a hurry to step over. It wasn't a human being I killed. It was a principal. So I killed the principal. But I didn't step over. I stayed on this side. All I managed to do was kill. I didn't even manage that, as it turns out. This again shows Raskolnikov's paranoia and fear of his actions, the guilt that he encompasses, which ultimately becomes a driving force in his downward spiral throughout the story, as he becomes fixed in a conflict within himself through the duality of his guilt and his want to save himself from the punishment that his guilt thinks he must serve. And these are the themes that are shared among all four stories, and that is the end of my presentation. Thank you.